Queer Relation Tips, an iAmClinic podcast devoted to helping you, the LGBTQ plus community, create the love lives and relationships you crave.
You know, honestly, when I discovered a term for it, it was because there was another person in my life who was an important person in my life at that time that also identified as non-binary. And they were kind of the first person to really explain to me, like, kind of what I experienced. I just didn't think about gender, I guess, is the way I would say. I kind of just put it in an irrelevant box, probably because there wasn't a term that made the most sense to me until like later in my life. So I was just like, sure, like I'm a girl, you know. But you know, I think it was really helpful to hear their description of it. And then I started to kind of do more of a gender discovery process for myself. And I started asking people a lot of questions and actually paying attention to my gender more fully.
Happy Pride, y'all. Welcome to today's episode of Queer Relation Tips. On today's episode, I have one of the massive pillars of iAmClinic. They are a gender non-binary person who is very instrumental in what we do at iAmClinic. As a visionary, I sometimes lack the business know-how, and this person, Jamie, just brings such a perspective that allows us to do something really beautiful here at the clinic. I wanted them to come on the show today, however, to talk about what it feels like to be an NB person, a gender non-binary NB person, to describe their experiences. Oftentimes I feel that I flux between gender non-binary and gender non-conforming. I identify as bisexual in my sexual orientation, but as culturally gay. It's a way that I can help kind of make sense of who I am in this world. And Jamie and I have some conversations about that from time to time. And I just find the experience of Jamie to be so informative and so liberating. The stability and the internal confidence that they bring just in who they are, not only to iAmClinic, is such a liberating force. As someone who experiences the flux, to see someone who could very easily look like they're living out a heterosexual life, and we'll get to that in today's episode, but to live so confidently as a non-binary person and a mother. I just think that that blend is so beautiful and really kind of speaks to how we talk about gender fluidity and the sexual fluidity here at the clinic. I always like to think that it's a recipe. You know, my chocolate chip cookie recipe is going to be very different than my neighbor's next door, even though we're making the same thing. And I really respect and enjoy that kind of diversity. In today's episode, we talk about what it felt like to recognize for the first time that they were NB, and what it felt like to come out all the way up until motherhood and how it works for them. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Let's take a listen. Let's start maybe in a different place, but what did your first experiences of being gender non-binary feel like?
Mm-hmm. You know, I think that's a kind of interesting thing to think about, because my first experiences really started when I was a kid, but I wouldn't have known how to name that until I was like way later into adulthood, because I really didn't figure out the term for how I experienced my gender until I was like 30, which is kind of hard to believe. But you know, when I was a kid, and I still look back on it and kind of smile. So Peter Pan was my hero, and that was what I always played as. And I very much, I think if you were able to like have a kind of fly on the wall, and my sister, you know, experienced this firsthand, but I very much, you know, exuded play in a non-binary way. I probably leaned more toward like the Peter Pan role just because that's my like absolute hero. But like, I mean, I could also be like just as equally like girly or feminine. And I mean, there was a whole bunch of stories just even growing up like that, right? Where it's kind of like, you know, my, like when I was 2, like my mom brought home this like purple dress or whatever that I threw like an absolute fit about because I didn't want to wear it. But then when I put it on, I like wouldn't take it off until it was like in total shreds. So, I mean, I don't know. It's just like kind of interesting looking back on it. And so those were really my first experiences with them throughout. It's a fascinating thing to look back on because, I think I've always felt to some extent like I didn't quite fit in one box or the other. But I never knew what to call that. And I know that, if I was at a party or something like that, and looking at things from, I know it's all very socialized and everything else, but looking at things from like a very spectrum based thing, right? Where people maybe lean more on like the super masculine side or people lean more on the super feminine side. I never really felt fully like myself if it was too tilted one or the other, in regards to just like connecting. And so I think I've always kind of gravitated toward people that even if they don't identify, right, as non-binary or genderqueer or fluid, that like I've always found myself finding like more of like a feeling of home with people who are kind of a little bit more in the middle. But honestly, like when I discovered a term for it, it was because there was another person in my life who was an important person in my life at that time that also identified as non-binary, and they were kind of the first person to really explain to me like kind of what I experienced. I just didn't think about gender, I guess, is the way I would say. I kind of just put it in an irrelevant box, probably because there wasn't a term that made the most sense to me until like later in my life. So I was just like, sure, like I'm a girl, but I think it was really helpful to hear their description of it. And then I started to kind of do more of a gender discovery process for myself. And I started asking people a lot of questions and actually paying attention to my gender more fully. And I had gone to a conference that year, a professional conference, and I went to a panel, or not a panel, a breakout session that was on gender inclusive language and like how to kind of utilize all that. And I was in a little breakout group with somebody who also identified as non-binary, and they were saying, there's times when like my feminine side really shows up and like times when my masculine side shows up, and it's interesting to see how those play out, but they're not like separate. It's just kind of one like leads more than the other in certain situations. And my response at that time was just kind of like, yeah, like who doesn't have that experience, which is a little dismissive if I'm like fully honest. But then I started asking people questions, and it turns out a lot of people don't have that experience, and they don't experience like a both and they don't think about it that way. So I did a ton of soul searching, and it just felt so good in a lot of ways over the time. It was scary to some extent too, just because it was an understanding of self, and then what does all that mean, and what does it mean for advocacy, and what does it mean for coming out, and like all of that. But it was very helpful, and I think the big turning point for me, which I would not put as a qualifier to anybody else, was just that I realized, like I would be equally comfortable in either expression. And I think there's a lot of non-binary people who prefer, different expressions. But I think for me, it was kind of like, either a male body or a female body would be expressive, because there's not yet like something that's really both, Mm-hmm. And so that was really like a solid thing for me. And it, like anything else in the process of coming out, was nerve-wracking. There's lots of misunderstanding, lots of actual, like at times, having to confront your own difference and loneliness in that difference, like is, I think, a huge bridge. Because if you choose to come out in any way, shape, or form, you're going to have to choose to understand that like people won't fully understand what that experience is like for you, even if they're in the same bucket, or also like, especially if they're not, there's going to be a ton of assumptions. And And then also, it's a fascinating thing with pronouns too, because there's still not, like, in my opinion, I think they, them, theirs is great. And I feel really at home with those pronouns myself. And they're not perfect, right? Just because of the way that our language has been constructed. So, I think that's taken a while for people to get used to. And then you go through that whole process, right? Of like, how much do I make it a big deal? So anyway, there's lots there, Isaac. Okay, go on. I was like, you want to ask a different question? Because how have I experienced it? Like, my goodness, in what facet? Because I also think very deeply about things. And so there's been a lot of stuff, that has emerged from this, but I'm so thankful for it,
I think one part of our language, and I experienced this as kind of my route into the queer community, but I think for myself, I'm reflecting back. I obviously, as a 5-year-old, didn't know that being gay had anything to do with love and romance or even sex, but I still knew.
Yeah.
I was part of that community, but I think I told myself I'm gay because I'm feminine. So I was allowing my experiences of gender to classify me erroneously in terms of sexual orientation.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of us kind of find our route through that lack of language.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I'm lesbian because I'm masculine or a tomboy. And
Yeah.
those, they may coincide or may be correlated somehow, but they don't necessarily have to inform one or the other.
Totally.
And I think for a lot of us, I'm not saying a lot of us are using the wrong identity, like a tomboy really isn't a lesbian. That's not.
Yeah. Right. Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. But I do think the language is lacking. And I think that we, just to kind of, speak to the pronouns piece that you mentioned, but I do think that it would be nice if we had a lot more sophisticated language to
absolutely
articulate our experiences.
I totally agree with you. And even an understanding from an early age, right, of what the differences are in regards to so I think for me, I mean, it also, wasn't until I was in my early 20s that I also spent some time thinking sex and gender, sexual attraction or sexual expression and gender are not synonymous, right? Because that's what happens is it gets clumped in.
Right.
Sadly, right? The same thing that you were saying, where it's kind of gender gets clumped in, but also sexual preference gets clumped in with gender. And I think, there is just a helpful delineation that is starting to emerge, but that's still very much the case. And, it really limits the complexity of each human being. Because I think, every single person could really use some more information about understanding themselves. We do all these personality tests and everything else, which is super. I mean, I'm a huge fan of personality tests, but for self-understanding, but that gets skipped if you're heteronormative. If you're especially, it actually gets skipped if you are gay or lesbian, because we kind of these boxes, but it's sort of well, you my experience of being non-binary is not going to be the exact same as any other person who is. There's going to be similarities though, which is comforting, but it's really important to not bypass that, self-understanding. But we have totally done that, right? Because there's just so many people where it's they don't know the nuances of how their soul is designed, essentially, because it gets clumped into what happened to me, right? Where it's well, there's no other option, so I'm a girl, And I mean, the richness that has come through that self-exploration has been amazing. And yes, it would be amazing to have legitimately widely recognized broader language, but even more importantly, broader understanding, because I think it brings a lot of freedom to a lot of people. But I do want to say too, I mean, there's such a deep interesting thing as well, the privilege of even growing up in a female body, right? So there's disadvantages, obviously. And I think time period makes a big difference of when I was born. But like, I think about your story and I think about people I knew growing up and everything. And yes, you are gay, right? But it's such a shame that like, because you're in a male body and wanted to present more of your feminine side, right? That had to be clumped together. That doesn't actually happen as often if you're in a female body, or at least I don't think it does, because fortunately through a lot of the advocacy of the feminist movement, like things like that, that has emerged to bring more rights, right? There's still a lot of progress that needs to be made. I mean, I think about my non-binary experience and it's like, I can walk around town wearing a tie, or something that is designed, like, or socialized to be incredibly masculine, right? And people are like, oh, that's cute, or like, look at you, like playing with gender, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
But that doesn't happen if you're in a male body playing with gender, like not, you know what I mean? Like I don't immediately become a target necessarily, right?
Sure.
So there's a lot of interesting things about that that
Mhm.
I've like come to learn and appreciate, where it's like, man, that would be so hard, because then you get all of these messages. And I think especially in the time period when we grew up, right, that was huge. Like there was just still so much of that homophobia, transphobia
Mhm.
that got passed down through, I mean, the generations, right?
Sure. Yeah, I definitely think it was passed down, but I think it was also, um, I was 5 years old in 1988, and that
Mhm.
was kind of the, like, point in time when the hatred and the fear around homosexuality was inflamed because of the AIDS pandemic,
Mhm.
and so everybody was kind of hyper aware of, at least in my opinion,
Yeah.
hyper aware of who was feminine and who were those people.
Yeah.
There was a lot more discussions about love the sin or hate the sin, and people, were actively talking about it on TV with their campaigns and things like that. So yeah,
Mhm.
I think for men especially, when they say I'm gender non-binary, it means that I think by and large,
Yeah.
for them, it no longer means they can identify as gay because that's a male to
Yeah.
male orientation. Um, and so I like the split of saying, and this is where I wonder if it'll resonate with you, but I like to say in my sexual orientation, I'm bi or pan or just queer.
Mhm.
All those feel like the same experience to me, but culturally, I'm gay.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think that's because if I were to date a female, I don't think I would feel comfortable in the heterosexual
Mhm. Mhm.
culture.
Yeah.
Like going to a barbecue where all the men are outside playing football and all the women are inside,
Mhm.
chit-chatting about, like, I would feel very uncomfortable. I'd want to be in the kitchen with all the women.
Yeah.
And there's many pieces of the queer culture that I love, and that feels like home to me. So I just wonder, what is
Yeah.
your experience if
Right.
we thought about delineating
Yep.
gender from culture?
If I thought about delineating, what was that last part?
Gender identity from cultural identity.
Yeah, totally. I know. That's a big one. Well, and I do also want to like even validate that so much more fully, because it is really, I mean, right? It gets complicated with everybody's unique story. And even like mixed orientation couples that we work with, or even, you know, gay couples that are working on like, one partner is like figuring out their gender and everything else. I mean, it gets really deeply ingrained, right? Where it's kind of like, because that's a huge part of the identity, right? Is like, am I in a gay relationship anymore if my partner's non-binary?
Mm-hmm.
Or I think what you just described is, it's kind of like, how do I step out of my, my heteronormative lifestyle to come out if I'm in a mixed orientation relationship? when there's systemically just like all of these locked in things, right? The barbecue idea. So I was just really resonating with that just because we see that a lot with couple work at iAmClinic too. And a lot of what you're speaking to, and it gets really complicated, which is, both, yeah, it's a lot of it because of norms in society. But how do I experience that in culture in terms of like my own gender identity and like how that's played out? Yeah, I think, that is a big one. It's a big box, but a really important one. So it was very helpful for me to also delineate some things, right, when I was in the process of coming out, where it's kind of like, oh, like the gender unicorn, I think is really helpful. That would be a plug for a resource for anybody who's looking for ways to describe themselves differently, or the genderbread person. But just kind of breaking it down a little bit, where it's like, okay, like, how do I experience my gender? And then how do I experience my attraction? And then how do I experience my sexuality? As those are the three things that I think tend to get kind of way too mixed up for one reason or another. And, for me, it was really helpful to be like, okay, my gender feels like two substances got poured into the same cup of about equal proportions, right? It's hard to say exactly like what those percentages are, but like it feels pretty balanced and pretty equal. And I'll speak to that in just a second. And then I think for me, on an attraction level, I was realizing like, oh, I'm attracted to so many different body types. I find so many different body types attractive. I find female body types attractive. I find trans body types attractive and male body types attractive. But I think when it really comes down to like who I want to express sexuality with, in terms of actually being in a sexual experience, I find myself most comfortable and at ease there, and with male bodies. But also that's a huge piece too, because I am a very monogamous person. So it's like, turns out I fell in love with and have created my life and home with a person who's in a male body. And that's probably really most important now that I'm older, right? Which is, it's like the person I'm with, as opposed to necessarily the body type that they're in. If I had fallen in love with somebody else in the same way that was in a female body, I'd probably feel that way now too, So it's like, how much does that influence, right? The person that you're with does influence that, at least for me, right? So, but I think that as far as like that element of substances, I mean, my goodness, like the two substances going into a cup, it's been just so interesting, because of just even the sense of being in a female body, learning how to take space, right? Learning how to have assertiveness and everything else. I also I believe I am in type 8 on the Enneagram in a female body. And that's a fascinating combination too, just because tends to be a more like assertive role. So I think for a long time, I was closeted in many ways, right? As far as my whole self goes, because you learn to like kind of be careful about taking up space. You learn to, kind of figure out what it is, that will make you fall into just enough as opposed to too much or not enough, if that makes sense. Those are kind of the two wound spectrums, right? And I think I navigated both of those. I struggled with the too much part a lot. And, I mean, there's all kinds of things that come from that. I really resonate with you around, like that part where it's like, man, the majority of the time, if I'm like at a party where there's conversations happening or whatnot, I usually find myself gravitating toward hanging out with people in male bodies than people in female bodies, depending on what the content of the conversation is. Yeah, I mean, I think my brain is like kind of like, whoa, there's a lot here. So I don't know if there's like a more specific question that might be helpful, because I realize I could probably ramble on for like a really long time about it. But it's painful. I think, there is an acceptance of having to like realize that anytime you choose to accept the differences about yourself, you have to then see the pathway, right, in which that's going to create more connection for you because of compassion and understanding and bridging and having a softening, right? Because we don't have those rigid like defenses in place when we kind of start to accept ourselves. And that's a huge blessing and a huge gift, and has been throughout my life, like accepting my own vulnerability and being able to lean into that a little bit more, and then actually receive relationship as opposed to kind of having that be a one-sided experience. I mean, all of those things are amazing and very rich potential rewards, right? And then there's the other side too, where it's like you have to learn how to tolerate difference and loneliness in that difference to some extent, being a really good friend to yourself. Because again, there's going to be a lot of misunderstanding, and also a lot of limitation. I mean, the acceptance place of like, spaces where you have to think through it, right? Where it's kind of like, oh, like, I don't know if I feel like having that conversation with these people, or I don't know if I want to come out every single time that I meet somebody. I don't know if I want to go through the energetic exchange that it would take to try to get people to continually remember my pronouns, right? I also think it's that struggle too, where you're like, I'm a whole person, so I don't want to make my whole energetic life about just that one facet of me either. But it's hard because you go into lots of situations where it's like there's just so many assumptions and so many like, things that you kind of have to wade through. And so I'm a big fan of cultivating your inner circle, and that's been a huge thing for me. Is it's like, okay, when I'm at home, if the people in my like home life are generally really good about my pronouns, if the people who are close people to me are generally good about my pronouns, that helps me a lot in the kind of like, cognitive dissonance of engaging the world. But yeah, you see it through a different lens for sure. And actually, ironically, in this day and age, I'm aware of like how, privilege in being a male body exists too, but there's a lot of privilege in being a female body as well, which we don't always talk about, depending on what spaces you're in. So.
Yeah.
Hope you're enjoying the show so far. The team and I have been so excited about some of the episodes we've been able to put together that we'll be releasing soon. One of the reasons I love these episodes so much is because they are from people just like us. People thumbing through TikTok or hopping on Grindr and Tinder and exploring the world and bumping into their own insecurities or challenges that keep them from living the love lives and relationships they crave. We would love to hear from you. If you have any questions at all, it is your story and your voice that make this show so special. Hop on over to www.iamclinic.org/queer-relation-tips and fill out the Google form if you want to be on the show. We would love to have you as a guest. Thanks for listening. Now let's get back to the show.
Does it feel like a microaggression to you if someone on the street or at a barbecue, for example, we can't do that one, but we're to assume that you're both a straight heterosexual couple and refer to you that way, or does that feel comfortable?
It does not feel comfortable. I don't think for either me or my partner. But I think, what would be the term? So microaggression, I don't know if I would necessarily feel like it's that way for me in those instances. I mean, it could be, right? I'm not saying it doesn't. I think that there's definitely times when it's that way. Missed opportunity would be a huge piece, kind of just that sense of like paying attention to, okay, like, I think we all have to do this to some extent, right? Where it's kind of like, okay, what what parts of me is this relationship going to allow to be seen? So it's like I am willing and available to open that up, right? Because I used to not be, right? I used to be a very transparent person, but not a very vulnerable person. And now it's kind of like, okay, you test the waters, you try to figure it out, but I'm open to increasing vulnerability as safety allows, right? And there's just a sadness there too, to some extent, because it's like there's a lack of permission, right? That there's going to be some level of conflict, some level of relationship break, right, in order to be my whole self. That will happen when immediately off the bat misgendered, mistyped, right, like not even allowed to have space to like be queer, right? And then also trying to have to balance that, right, of like how much do I want to deal with like the other person's discomfort? So in the traditional sense, it's like, yes, I think maybe what I'm trying to look back on is more I just experienced it as a missed opportunity, like where it's kind of like, oh man, there's a lot more that this person could like know about me. There's a lot more about my experience and a lot more about like our conversation that could like go really differently and be really different. That's not really allowed to take place. But there's definitely times when I have felt the microaggression piece of it for sure. And I think that just comes into the really like limited understanding of what gender means and what personality means and all of that kind of stuff too. I think for me, probably the thing that really gets my goat is the fact that I have always throughout my life had very strong relationships with people in male bodies. It just is the way that I have been. Which in some ways is not surprising given the fact that like in my own gender story, connecting more to my feminine side has actually been the harder piece as opposed to my masculine side. I feel more comfortable in my kind of more masculine side. And I mean, throughout a lot of my healing work and everything else connecting to like what I experience as my feminine side, right, outside of socialized constructs, has been a harder thing for me. So in some ways it doesn't surprise me. But boy, does that make me mad sometimes when people just assume, especially in certain cultures, right, that like that's an immediate like eyebrow raise or problem or threat to your relationship or threat to your marriage.
Yeah. I think for Joe and I, technically we have a mixed orientation relationship. Him being gay, not only in his sexual orientation, but also culturally, and me identifying as something other than gay in our gay relationship. And I think it's really easy, well, not really, but I mean, it doesn't take many conversations to kind of iron out what that means, especially because we are monogamous.
Sure.
But I would imagine for you and your partner, there's a lot more nuances to kind of discuss.
In our relationship, or what? Yeah.
Finding out the term gender binary, resonating with it at 30 years old, and then maybe to pivot and say, now what does this mean for my relationship?
Yep. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I'm very, very, I have to say, I am very blessed in the sense that I have a partner who has been the picture of unconditional love and acceptance, and has been such a source of healing for me in that through so many different facets, and just really like embrace that. But what's really cool is even though Tim doesn't identify or anything, he is so open to doesn't identify as like gender non-binary or something like that, like is just has just been so explorative on his own, and like likes pushing kind of some of the gender norms. Like he gets his nails painted and does all that kind of stuff, which we both like kind of like giggle about as such a like big deal to so many people. Do you know what I mean? It's
Oh, for
like,
sure.
it's
Yeah.
literally like color on your nails. It's like fine, but I mean, I'll tell you, like, if it just, I mean, if you want people to raise an eyebrow, it's like, that's the thing. I was like, kind of even talking about, it's like, man, that is so fascinating. But I think what's really helpful for us, and we've been really fortunate on that, is like our team effort in our relationship, like, really has not been defined by the bodies that we're in. I mean, I guess sometimes they are, but it's really not out of that place of like, oh, you get to do this, because it's more like, what are our preferences, and then how do we get life done, that kind of element. But there are a ton of nuances to it, for sure. And I think I'm thankful I've had somebody who's really sensitive, where it's like and empathic, right, where it's like we might go to dinner with like a new couple or something like that, and we're processing afterward, and Tim is kind of like, man, like, that's so hard, like, how do you decide like who you're gonna tell? And then like every time you hear the wrong pronouns and stuff like that, it's just kind of like another experience of like, do I say something or don't I, right? And so it is a really fascinating thing. I think for us, becoming new parents has been really fascinating too. It's been a whole nother exploration and understanding of gender, and even just like socialized norms, right? The norms of like almost like hyper praising engaged fatherhood, and kind of assumption around like natural motherhood. I think for me, it's been really fascinating, and this could be, and probably should be, a whole nother episode, is like the difference between, right, we gender things like mother and father, right? And I'm not 100% sure that mother and father are, connected to just the bodies that we're in or the gender we express. I think it's a whole nother entity. And mother is something I very much like feel toward my daughter, and that's interesting, because it did not change at all my experience of my gender being non-binary, but it did change my understanding of like what I experience as like my role, or my defining role with my daughter. But like, I think, that's really interesting, because it's not actually even out of a socialized place why I feel that way. And with Tim, I mean, he also very much identifies with father, but we both exude, just a ton of warmth, care, you know what I mean, that kind of thing. But there's just such a difference.
That each person can be nurturing, yes, and each parent can be protective, and it doesn't mean more as one father or mother, quote unquote, as more than
exactly
the other,
That's exactly right. Exactly. Like, and I think that's always been, even with Tim, that's always been a big thing for me, is like, I mean, my goodness, like, he has the ability to be so warm and caring and safe and all of these things that we tend to ascribe, you know what I mean? He's been the picture of that for me, in our relationship. And, those are all attributes and traits that we assign, outside of that. But it is still fascinating how much praise he gets for being a really engaged father. And I get praise too, but it's different. And it is interesting as well, because like we do get a lot of questions, not all the time. I mean, actually, I get less questions than I would expect, but like, we still assign like, like the gender or the sex essentially assigned at birth or whatnot with Evangeline, like, as female, because that's just all we know so far, right? And I feel like probably that's colored by my own experience to some extent, where it's like, well, like, sometimes to find out what you really are, you have to kind of like have a starting point, something to work with, where it's like, is this what I am or isn't it? And I know like developmentally that's a big piece too. But even having people like a whole nother layer of like, here's mommy, and like saying there and they and them with mommy has been another point of transition, even for me at times, right? Because we always associate she with that name. So much stuff here.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you experience some of that stuff too. If you feel like sharing, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, Joe and I just have a
Yes.
puppy. And we were sitting down with a friend last night making fun of like the roles that we each play in the house and how we take care of the dog together. And Joe said something like, yeah, and I didn't even get a present for Mother's Day. And my first reaction was, wait, I'm the mom. Like, I should have gotten something for Mother's Day. Like, I'm the one who's nurturing. I'm the one, like, all of these stereotypical labels.
Sure.
But it's interesting to see, even in our relationship, how we've used gender and our experiences of it. Even our experiences of caring for our dog that are so invisible that inform the way we see ourselves out in the world, like I often think that like I learned so much from my mom and my Aunt Sarah in terms of how to love and be nurturing, and I always thought, well, then I'll have that kind of maternal energy
For sure.
family. But yeah, I do think it'll be interesting to see. I was thinking about that because Mother's Day wasn't too long ago, and thinking about, are you celebrating Mother's Day? Is it a day that you'd like to? Is there another day on the calendar that would represent more of how you feel as a parent? And then even thinking for our child someday, what would we do on Mother's Day? Or do we kind of ignore it and celebrate something else? And so, yeah, I think all of that is still kind of brewing in my heart. I'm excited to see how I resonate, what resonates with me as those parts of my identity unfold, parent and married spouse as opposed to just partner. Not that that's how Joe and I delineate things. So yeah, I don't know. There is a lot to think about. I think the one thing that I do appreciate about the way you describe it today is the confidence seems really important. The confidence to say, this is my experience, and that's what's right for me. And in the queer community, because sexuality and gender are both physiologically fluid, that I think we have to respect that fluidity and to find, almost like I'm thinking of like what do they call those things? I'm not a construction person, but the balance with the tubes with the bubbles, so you can know you're hanging something straight. What do they call that thing?
Oh, the level.
Level, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's, like if you were to slap a level up on the wall, we would each tilt it until that bubble was right where it needed to be for each of us.
Yeah.
I think for a cisgender person, it might be like
Good analogy.
flipping it totally vertically, because the bubble would be on one side of that spectrum. Whereas mine is much more of a 45 degree, or whereas yours might be right in the 90, or who knows. But
and like kind of the bubble, like kind of with like maybe right there, and like it's kind of like it's kind of like vibrating back and forth. Like right, it's back and forth. Yes, that is true. That's such a good way of describing it. I agree. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
No, I was just going to reaffirm one more time that I think the most important thing is to find the confidence to know what is true for ourselves. And then I think as people in the queer community, to respect differences, to say you're using the same term I do but in a different way, or we're part of the same gender non-binary community, but your binary expressions are totally different than mine. And in no way do I have to hold you accountable to my expressions, or vice versa,
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes. If that was like the anthem of humanity, that would be great. But also it is fascinating, I think, speaking, from the broader community, because right, LGBTQ IA plus, as it continues to grow, I mean, strength in numbers, right? So that's kind of a huge part of what was necessary, is it's kind of like, in order to be seen or to be heard, got to kind of band together. But the other thing that I think is interesting psychologically that I've noticed over the years, and especially in clinical work, is this concept of quote unquote the community, right? Will the community accept me because I haven't been living in this identity? Or will the community accept me because I am bisexual and have not ever been with somebody in the same body type sexually? Will the community accept me if I, am in a mixed orientation relationship, right? This idea of the community. And it's so fascinating because it is a psychological construct, right? It's like, what is the community anyway? It's the people that you cultivate in your life, right? But it makes sense, right? Because we're trying so hard to figure out, like, where do we fit in? And so it's this balance of trying to make sure you find your people. But as we're uncertain about ourselves, which is very much a normal process, looking inward, we're trying so hard to find those external validations that tell us you're okay, right? I mean, I think about that where it's like, man, that's everything. That's a huge stage of power, right? When you're feeling powerless, is to look toward grades, right? They tell you you're okay, or they tell you you're smart, or they tell you you're, or like evaluations, different status symbols, right? Like tell us like we're okay, like that kind of stuff, and shield us from experiencing our vulnerability. And I think, yeah, it's a balance, right? To try to find that confidence of relationship with yourself, where it's kind of like, the fact of the matter is like, I'm going to walk through the world and I'm going to find the people who see me, and I'm going to be open to experiencing those relationships. And that is going to give me an anchoring within a larger picture to then continue to have permission to see myself. And there's going to be so many other people who don't, right? And even in the quote unquote the community, there'll be so many people who don't, right? So many people who are in their own process. And even the things that I say, I mean, I'm aware of it, even talking in this podcast right now. There's always that feeling of like, oof, like, is this going to be interpreted, you know what I mean, in a way that feels unhelpful to somebody or something like that. And that's always a vulnerable thing and never ever the intention. But I think that there is that permission. And the coolest part, I mean, is realizing like the more you do that, then the more permission you give the other people around you to do that too. And then the more you get to experience like the delights of yourself, but also like the delights of how every other person is unique. And that uniqueness doesn't have to then threaten, right? You don't have to then be that person in order for them to be themselves. It's like the picture of actual diversity, right?
That's what I was just thinking, like kind of thinking between the lines of what you're saying, or kind of making my own conjecture, if you will. But this idea of like, in order to have beautiful diversity, we must also have true safety.
Yes.
Like I am safe with all of these people, and now my community, to use that word, is not only made up of lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer,
right,
trans people, but also cis, straight, multicultural. Yes. And because I'm safe with all of these people, now this diverse group is my community.
That's right.
Yeah, I think that's a really good reminder for a lot of us.
Yeah.
Because I think we say I'm safe only with these people, or it's hard to step out of that pocket of being safe only within the queer community, because it's been so painful to not find safety outside of it. I mean, there's so many different scenarios here, but
and it's safety to not find safety within it too, right? Like there's that piece. I mean, my goodness, that happens all the time. Right. I mean, so many of our clients are just like having to navigate that, where it's like, they're not the quote unquote typical gay guy or they're not the quote unquote typical lesbian or, typical trans person or whatever, which is kind of like, what does that even mean? But that's so human, right? But I think back to what you were saying about cultivating safety. I think it does. It's that both and. It starts within, right? It's like, am I even safe inside of myself? Am I connected and integrated and aware of myself? Because when we look to the shifting sands of all of the external things in the world to do that for us, it's very anxiety producing, right? Because it's constantly changing. I mean, think about just fashion, right? It's like constantly changing. So it's kind of like, but that's the reason, part of it why, right? Like, I mean, people want to like be regulated. And I think there's so much fun with it. That's a whole nother thing. But like, I think it's kind of like balancing that, because of course we need some external regulation to some degree because we're relational beings, right? It's just trying to figure out that level, right? Where it's kind of like, okay, how much is the outside affecting the inside? And then what is it that I need to do with the inside in order to be effectual essentially on the outside? And invitational, that kind of idea. But yeah, even going back to that, I think mentally it's like it becomes kind of the picture of nervousness, right? The community, right? Like I think people almost imagine like walking into some kind of nightclub and it's like there's this almost like mass of people that are going to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down. They're going to clap for you or they're going to boo at you, right? And it's like so much more individualized than that. And I think that's the other piece of it too. And recognizing that there could be disappointment there, right? Because there's a lot of people within the quote unquote community, right? That really haven't done this work yet, right? And are actually very rigid because of their own pain, right? And it makes sense to me. It's kind of like if you have been ostracized, bullied, hurt, misunderstood, told you're wrong, right? It kind of soothes that part of you in a way that's, not long-term fruitful, but it soothes that part of you to then try to do that to other people, right? Sure. And say, now I have the power to say, you're right, you're wrong, you're problematic, you're not. And I think in some ways that's actually where a lot of the harshness stems from, which is super sad because we have the ability to like support, heal, and be like so like powerful. I think of that like Maya Angelou, quote where it's kind of like, the scariest thing essentially is like recognizing the power that we do have in the world. That's the thing that we're most terrified of. It's, that element of, really walking through that pathway, right? And being our whole self and navigating that. It's intense work. And it's so lifelong, right? It's ongoing. Absolutely. There's so many seasons.
And I feel like just as much as I experience the fluctuation between female and male or masculinity and femininity, you also feel the fluctuation of feeling so tied to my most powerful self and so disconnected from it. Some days it's like, sure. I got it, I'm in alignment, I'm here, I'm showing up. And then the next day it's like, where's my creativity? Where's my power?
Yeah.
And I think,
totally.
Yeah, to kind of respect that some days, maybe we grow more and more into it. So it's more and more consistent. I don't know, but I can tell at 37 years old, I do feel like there are seasons when it almost feels intentional to say right now I am supposed to be in it. And then there's other seasons where it's like I'm supposed to grow and I'm supposed to rest and I'm supposed to enjoy other facets of me. I don't know if that's
that's a really good way of saying that.
Yeah. So
yeah, for sure. I think about that, like, very metaphorically, right? But like true, like the seasons of life, like being kind of like the seasons we go through, like the tree like gets to bloom and like be in spring and have all of these leaves, but because of the winter. And the winter is like a little bleaker and it's a little, harsher to some extent, but that's when the roots grow. And if we embrace that, then we get to have bigger branches and more full trees in the spring and summer, right? And I think that's just a challenge because, right, we're so driven toward trying to preserve and maintain and stay in a perpetual spring and summer.
Right.
Throughout life, right? And that's the part where we feel most connected and like flourishing and like all of this stuff. But I agree with you. I mean, it's in those seasons when it's seemingly dead or stripped away or whatnot, and it's a little bleaker, that the roots grow, and then something else more abundant can actually take place I could not have envisioned in the previous one. And if I had held on too tightly, toward trying to maintain a perpetual state, I would have missed it. Right. Sure. And so there is, I think, that ebb and flow and the permission, but it's kind of that sense too of realizing like, okay, like the roots are really important, right? Because otherwise the tree can topple over.
For sure. Right.
And I think that's the balance of like accepting that fluctuation where it doesn't mean that there isn't the tree, right? The tree's still there, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It just may feel more vulnerable or like whipped around. It is an interesting element. And I think that's the other piece is, we have to accept the both and, right? Mm-hmm. And celebrate when we feel seen and celebrate when we feel understood. Celebrate when we feel connected to ourselves, connected to others, and have that richness. And then also recognize that like there just won't be a reality that we create that prevents us from having to grieve the ways in which we are misunderstood, the ways in which we aren't seen, the ways in which we're assumed about, right? And boxed in. And that actually is, it is the complexity of literally being human. It's just that I think on a spectrum, there's more people who choose, right, to not see those different facets of themselves because it's a way to bypass the pain.
For sure.
But it's still there. It's like still there for sure. None of us get to escape it. Yeah, but I think I'm resonating a little bit with the weight of phobia when I think about this particular topic and how hard that is and how sad it is. Because I mean, I guess I'm just like tapping into like a pretty deep wave of grief, and my heart goes out to all of us, like myself included, but every single person I know where it's like, man, to experience the fact that like people literally have a phobia about you.
And that it's so
painful.
Yes. It shows up in the world in so many different ways, through rhetoric, through language, through vocal expressions, through treatment and injustice. Like it kind of bombards us in so many subtle ways that this is the frustrating part for me as someone who's lived through this and as a Christian who sees it in other people, but that we start to internalize it.
Yeah.
And that we use their shame against ourselves.
Yeah.
But this time without them. We just picked it up and started using it, And I do think that's kind of why I like this confidence that you express, because it feels very sturdy to say when those hurricanes come and my branches are swaying in the wind, I know that they're strong enough. And part of that is because Tim is such a beautiful root system, but also part of that is because I've taken time to really understand what this means and how beautiful it is. And
and that we would each be okay ultimately without each other if we had to be, right? Like we hope never happens, or at least not in any time soon. But there is that like piece of that. And honestly, I mean, as I'm thinking about it, I'm like, right, the antidote to fear is love. And so, as we internalize the phobias around us, the, hatred or the fear, really, which is all what that roots into, the only antidote is love, right? Is to connect and to love ourselves and to love others as best we can. And that's really hard work. It is so hard it's so powerful, but it's also not a given. It takes energy, it takes work, it takes like saying, hey, I'm not going to let the world harden me. I'm going to continue to, even through tears, even through grief, hardship, trauma, loss, find that ember, find that glow, find that, part where I can say I'm worthy of love. I'm going to love myself and I'm going to love other people. And that's, I think, the only antidote to this. And boy, how different the world would be if we could all just do that. But,
Yeah. I do think about this from time to time, but the idea for me, and this is kind of where I land as a therapist, but it was this experience of discovering not just how to love myself, but to experience what it felt like to I'll be redundant here, but what it felt like to feel my own inherent value, not just learn about it.
to
Not
feel
just to
it.
swallow this fact, I'm inherently valuable.
Yes.
Actually feel inherently valuable was the beginning for me to love who I am. And then I began to see the inherent value in everybody else.
Yep.
And I don't think if from a clinical perspective, I could be wrong, but I don't see how, if we don't know how to feel inherently valuable, we might still hold criticisms for ourselves, and therefore we'll be critical of all of those parts in other people.
I agree.
So I think the how part is embracing our inherent worth as a way to get to that love for self and love for others.
Yeah, I completely resonate with that for sure. Right. Because even if people are like, oh no, I see how awesome everybody else is. Right. That can be the way, like, it's like really tricky, is that like that then is a shame narrative that's separating, and also a little dangerous from the lens of like every single human being on the planet has flaws.
Yeah.
Right. But sometimes we can kind of play that game where it's like everybody has got this figured out more than me, or they're better off than I am, or whatnot.
Every year as we approach Pride, I try to think of it from different perspectives because I want to honor the totality, the holistic approach of our lives. Of course, Pride is all about self-esteem and celebrating who we are, and I think that's wonderful. This year, however, I want to emphasize where we are culturally after George Floyd's death and all of the work of Black Lives Matter. I thought that I would really focus on Pride this year in terms of anti-transphobia, anti-homophobia, anti-biphobia, basically anti-oppression. As I listen to stories like Jamie's, I think that there is such beauty in overcoming the oppression, one person, one story, one family at a time. Because this is in many ways how we tear down oppression at large. When I was an undergrad student, in one of my sociology classes, we talked about this theory of being a simplistic interactionist. And these theorists describe a system where each small interaction, every simple little interaction on the street, in our homes, in our cars, through media, they add up, creating our culture. And if we have all of these little simple interactions that counter culture or counter oppression, sooner or later we will see the demise and the destruction of the one thing holding us back. As a friend and a coworker with Jamie, I get a good view into their life, and they are just so full of love and strength. But one of the things that I appreciate about Jamie the most is their confidence, the ability to almost appear culturally as a heterosexual family unit, and yet to hold with such grace and stamina this queer identity as being non-binary. It is amazing to me. And I find this to be so salient because it is the self-esteem in many ways that helps us push back and tear down the oppression the anti-trans, the transphobia in the world. I mention this as part of Pride, that as we reflect on who we are and how we have overcome oppression in our stories, even though there's probably much more to overcome and step over and tear down, that we all take a second to identify the ways in which we have used our story and our internal truth to fight against the local homophobia, whether it be in our families, our churches, our jobs, our cultures, and even that big one that rests within inside of us, that internalized transphobia or that internalized homophobia. As you move throughout Pride this month, I hope that you take time to recognize that we have a lot of work to do and that we get to celebrate the work we have accomplished. As I watched the hundreds of thousands of people across the world march in honor of Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, I cannot help but be inspired to speak my truth as a way of tearing down oppression. And I hope you find that courage as well. Until next time. Mwah.
Queer Relation Tips is a podcast sponsored by iAmClinic, a counseling practice devoted to the LGBTQ+ community with in-person and virtual counseling options available. iAmClinic. Create the love lives and relationships you crave. Find us online on Instagram at LGBTQ_therapy and Facebook at iAmClinic. That's iAmClinic.